Welcome to our Section 3 notes on bonding theories for Chapter 8. Now there are actually two bonding theories out there. The first one is called molecular orbital theory. What it does is it describes molecular orbitals that result from the overlap of atomic orbitals. Now these orbitals, molecular orbitals, apply to the molecule as a whole. They don't exist until atoms bond together to form a molecule. So that's one theory. Our other theory that we can talk about is VSEPR theory, or VSEPR theory. Now that stands for valence shell electron pair repulsion theory. It's just like it sounds. We've been talking about valence electrons, so valence shell refers to the electrons at the valence level. Electron pair repulsion is obviously where you have electron pairs, and due to their like charges, they're going to repel each other. So this name really makes a lot of sense if you know what VSEPR stands for. Now it's used to explain shapes of molecules, and those shapes result from the repulsion between those electron pairs that we've been studying, unshared pairs and bonding pairs. When orbitals of atoms overlap, it could result in a bond forming. Now what we've studied so far in terms of orbitals are s orbitals and p orbitals. We've also studied d and f, but recall that valence electrons normally are found in s and p orbitals only. So the valence electrons involved in bonding are found in those s and p orbitals of an atom's highest energy level. So what that means is that a bond could result from several different scenarios. You might have two s orbitals overlapping, as we see in this top diagram where two hydrogens are bonding together. Each of those electrons around a hydrogen are sitting in an s sublevel. Those are spherical shaped orbitals, and as those hydrogens approach each other, those spheres can overlap, and that overlap of those two edges of the sphere results in a bond forming. Another thing that can happen is down here at the bottom of this diagram, we see two fluorine atoms coming at each other. Now, those have their highest energy valence electron at a p sublevel, and so that unpaired electron on each fluorine is sitting in a p orbital, and those p orbitals can overlap end to end and result in a bond from that end-to-end overlap of two p orbitals. Or what you could have is the overlap of a spherical orbital with a double-lobed orbital, so an s and a p orbital overlapping each other, as we see with hydrogen fluoride. When two atomic orbitals overlap to form a symmetrical molecular orbit, what results is called a sigma bond. Now, that's what this Greek letter is here, is a sigma. So you may see it written as the word written out, sigma, or you might see it abbreviated in this fashion. Shown in this diagram on the right is a sigma bonding molecular orbital. Notice it's symmetrical, it's oval in shape, it has this blue bond axis right here that goes through the center of the two nuclei of the atoms that are bonding together. So a sigma bonding molecular orbital is formed symmetrically around that bond axis. Now if we have two p orbitals overlapping end to end, like when those two fluorine atoms bond that we talked about before, recall that those valence electrons are at the 2s2, 2p5 level, so that unpaired electron is in a p orbital. When those two orbitals overlap, the molecular orbital extends pretty much between the two nuclei, as you can see here, with only tiny portions going on the opposite side of the atoms that are bonding. Now, why does this molecular orbital bulge in the middle and have those two small areas on the outside of the bonding atoms? If you recall, when we draw orbitals, they're thought of as boundaries within which it's likely to find electrons. In this case, it's a boundary within which we expect to find a bonding pair of electrons. And so it's very likely you're going to find those two electrons in the middle there between the nuclei of the atoms that are bonding together. However, it is also within the realm of possibility that they could both end up on the far side of one of those nuclei. However, that's not nearly as likely, as you can tell from the small lobes, because those electrons are negatively charged. They're going to be attracted to both nuclei, and so it's likely you're going to find them somewhere in between those two nuclei. So we've looked at sigma bonds, which result from end-to-end overlap of s orbitals, or of s and p orbitals, or of two p orbitals. But what if we have two p orbitals that don't point at each other? What if they're parallel to each other? If that were the case, then the only way that they would overlap is if they moved close enough together that they could overlap side by side rather than end to end. So when we have the side-by-side or side-on overlap, what we get is a pi bond, the other type of molecular bond. Now the resulting bond, as I mentioned, is called a pi bond, which can be spelled pi, or of course using the pi symbol. It has a different shape as a molecular orbital. Notice that the overlap is in two distinct regions. There's overlap above the axis, there's overlap below the axis, but there isn't any overlap along the axis. So that results in those two distinct regions, so that pi bonding molecular orbital, that's just a single orbital shown on the right side there. So side-by-side overlap produces a single pi bonding molecular orbital, which consists of two sausage-shaped regions in which the bonding pair of electrons is most likely to be found. Since atomic orbitals have less overlap when they're side by side, pi bonds are usually weaker than sigma bonds, and so when bonds are broken, if there's both pi bonding and sigma bonding in the same location, the pi bonds are the ones that break first. Recall that we have learned how to draw structural formulas, and those are two-dimensional. They help us to figure out what's connected to what, but it doesn't really tell us how they're arranged in three-dimensional space because it's a two-dimensional drawing. But molecules exist in a three-dimensional world. What this means is, as electrons are repelling each other, they're going to try to get as far away from each other as possible, but they're going to do that in three-dimensional space. So even though on paper, if we're trying to get them away from each other, we might end up with like 90-degree angles, that's not as far apart as they can get themselves. If you have 4 electron pairs in three-dimensional space, they can get further apart than 90 degrees. They can get as far as 109.5 degrees apart. So let's try and think three-dimensionally, and we're going to use methane as an example. Methane has the formula CH4, and all of the electron pairs are bonding pairs, as you can see, between carbon and hydrogen. So our two-dimensional structural formula would look like this on the left. But that makes it look as if those would be 90-degree angles. Those can get further apart in three-dimensional space. So if we try and move over to our three-dimensional view, what we see is they can get a little further apart, and it's real obvious in this picture on the left that the angle in the top left part of this molecule is bigger than 90 degrees. However, it's not so easy to see that in the ones down towards the bottom of the picture. Those are also 109.5 degrees, but it's kind of hard to depict that on this screen because, once again, this is a three-dimensional molecule we're trying to depict on a two-dimensional screen. If we were to rotate that molecule around, we might get this view here on top, which is where we're looking right at a hydrogen and a carbon is directly behind it, bonded to it. And then we can easily see that those other 3 hydrogens are equally spaced around there with larger than 90-degree angles between them. You can see it's going to look different depending upon which direction you're looking at it. Now these bonding pairs in methane, as I mentioned, moving as far apart as possible is 109.5 degrees, and that's going to move all of those hydrogens to the corners of a three-dimensional shape known as a tetrahedron. Carbon's going to be sitting inside of the tetrahedron, kind of in the center of the shape. You can see that pictured here on the right. And the hydrogen-carbon-hydrogen bond angle, HCH bond angle, is 109.5 degrees. And all of those bonds, recall, are sigma bonds, and they're labeled as such in this diagram. Let's try ammonia now. Ammonia has the formula NH3. We've drawn a structural formula for it before. It has 3 bonding pairs and 1 unshared pair of electrons on the nitrogen. Now you might think that the bond angle would still be 109.5 degrees because, hey, we've got 4 pairs of electrons trying to get as far from each other in space as possible. But that's not actually the case. And you might be asking yourself, well, why wouldn't it be? But recall that unshared pair is not being attracted to 2 nuclei. It's only attracted to the nitrogen. So it's going to be able to be held closer to the nitrogen than the bonding electrons can be held, because they're being attracted to both hydrogen and nitrogen at the same time. With those electrons that are an unshared pair pulling down closer to nitrogen, they're going to have more of a repulsive force on those bonding electrons, causing those bonds to move a little bit closer together. So what we get is HNH bond angles that's slightly less than 109.5. So here's our methane molecule. We can see those bonding pairs in that left diagram. We can see we result in all 109.5 degree bond angles. But with ammonia, with that unshared pair up on the top where a hydrogen used to be in methane, in ammonia we don't have that bond to hydrogen, we have an unshared pair. And its ability to sit closer pushes those hydrogens closer together, those bonds between nitrogen and hydrogen. They get closer to each other, and you get 107 degrees between them instead of 109.5. And if you look at the right diagram, the top one has methane and has that tetrahedral shape with hydrogens at each of the corners. But nitrogen doesn't have a hydrogen going up. It just has that nitrogen. Now that nitrogen is not laying flat with those hydrogens. That nitrogen is popped up out of the plane with those. But this results in a slightly different shape. So we need to describe its shape next. So because one of those pairs is an unshared pair, the shape of the molecule is not tetrahedral because nitrogen is now an end. It's not in the center of the shape. It's actually an end of the shape. It's slightly raised up from those hydrogens, not in the same plane as they are, so we call this shape pyramidal. You have a triangular pyramidal base and the nitrogens popped up like the pinnacle of the pyramid. Now, we've also worked with water. We've drawn its structural formula, and in the past, I let you draw the structural formula like either one of these, and I said that's okay, because for what we were doing at the time, just showing what's connected to what, where's their unshared pairs, that was good enough. But now, we're interested in what's the true shape of a water molecule. So only one of these could be close to right, because the one on the left suggests that it's linear, and the one on the right suggests that it's bent. So the question is, which is it? Now remember, there are still 4 pairs of electrons repelling each other in 3-dimensional space. 2 non-bonding pairs and 2 bonding pairs. So if we put those 4 pairs going towards the corners of a tetrahedron, we can see that we do have a hydrogen-oxygen-hydrogen bond angle that is not going to be 180 degrees. It's not going to be linear because you have those 2 unshared pairs repelling each other as well as repelling the bonding pairs. And that means that those bonding pairs are going to get pushed closer together. They're not going to be straight out in a linear fashion. And so they get pushed a little bit closer together yet because there's 2 non-bonding pairs, unshared pairs on oxygen. So instead of 109.5 degrees or even 107 degrees, we see it get even closer together yet, and we get down to a 105 degree bond angle as the HOH bond angle. We've also drawn structural formulas for carbon dioxide, and if you recall, it has 2 double bonds going to those oxygen atoms. Carbon does not have any unshared pairs in this molecule, so all that it has around that central atom of carbon is 2 double bonds. So we have 2 bonds that are trying to get as far from each other in space as possible. No unshared pairs on carbon to be considered. So 2 things trying to get as far apart in 3-dimensional space as possible, well, that's going to be 180 degrees. And if you recall from geometry, a 180 degree angle is called a straight angle because it describes a straight line. And so this is a linear molecule. So carbon dioxide is definitely linear. It's not bent like water.